Well, thanks for coming out. If you can't hear me, just wave or holler or let me know. I'll try to keep my voice up. It's a long talk. It's about an hour. So I'm going to push through it as fast as I can to keep things moving along. Honest money. When we start to talk about honest money in a biblical sense, the first thing that comes to mind is this. Money is the root of all evil, right?
Wrong.
Wrong. Okay, thank you. The love of money is a root. So I just wanted to get that out of the way first, so we could get on with it. Tonight's objectives. There are a couple things I really want to try to get across tonight. What is money? Most people don't quite understand what it is. How did we get so confused about it? And why are we bothering to figure it out? Now, I'm going to hit this number 3 first. Why bother to figure it out? We are going to run into a monetary crisis in this country, and we're going to run into it for a couple of reasons. This is a graph of Social Security, Medicare. This is from 2008. It hasn't gotten any better. The debts that are being stacked up here, the promises, they're not really debts. It's only a debt if they have to pay you. They've said they're going to pay you, but if they don't appropriate the money, they don't owe it. Nonetheless, the obligations that are stacking up are unpayable. This is a graph of the federal surplus/deficit. We did have a surplus. For years and years, we ran nice and even. Comes the Reagan years, we really dipped. We had a little bit of positive in the Clinton years, and I mean, it's just kind of, it's frightening. Now, where do we get all that money? Well, we print it. We print money. We're making money up out of nothing and spending it. Now, it's gotten a little bit better, but it's still a deficit, so the debts continue to pile up. And our last graph, we're not going to do much more graphs. This is a graph of the adjusted monetary base. This is from this year. And does that look like a sustainable graph or trend to anybody? This is the money supply in this country, and they're just making it up so that we could spend it. This was to backstop the banks because of the 2008 financial crisis. So why are we going to have a financial crisis? Why are we going to have a monetary crisis? Because these things are not sustainable. So that's why we have to figure out what money is. So who scoffs at the notion that there's such a thing as biblical economy? Well, atheists and humanistic economists all scoff at this. If you try to find a professor in a college that thinks that the Bible has anything to say about economics, you'll be looking for quite a while. But you know what? Most Christians scoff at the same thing. Most Christians really don't think about, most professing Christians, people who say that they're Christians, would not say that the Bible really talks much about economy. We deal with compartmentalized Christianity in this country. And so one of the other goals for tonight is to make believers out of the believers. One of the best definitions of economics, this is one of my favorites, is from Lionel Robbins. He was a writer, libertarian economics writer in the 30s. And he defined this economics as the study of human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. And what I really like about this definition is that he deals with these 3 things: behavior, scarcity, and alternatives. When we're dealing with behavior, we're dealing with human action. We're dealing with people doing things that are either right or wrong. So we necessarily are dealing with the Bible, because it's the Bible that we have to turn to for right and wrong. If it's human behavior, we consult the Bible for right and wrong. Scarcity, we're blessed with scarcity as a people. If we didn't have scarcity, there would be no reason for us to work together. There would be no reason for people to trade with one another, because we wouldn't have anything that we're missing. We'd be autonomous. So scarcity is a blessing for the human race. Scarcity is something that leads to a matching up of supply and demand. And the way we match that up is through pricing. How do we know that we need something? Well, the price is high. So if the price is high, people will go out and try to provide that because we have a high price and they can make a profit. And if the prices go low, well then it's because there's a lot of it, the scarcity has been fulfilled, and that you get the supply-demand graph that meets it where it crosses is where you reach an equilibrium. So scarcity leads to price theory. Does the Bible talk about price theory? You bet it does. Let's read 2 Kings. It came to pass after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered all his hosts, went up and besieged Samaria. There was a great famine in Samaria. Behold, they besieged it till an ass's head, which was an unclean animal for the Jews, an ass's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver. That's 80 pieces of silver. And a fourth part of a cab of dove's dung. Now a cab would be about 2 quarts, so a fourth part would be about a pint of dove poop, was selling for 5 pieces of silver. As the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, there cried a woman unto him, saying, Help, my lord the king. And the king said unto her, What aileth thee? And she answered, This woman said to me, Give me thy son that we may eat him today, and will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son, and did eat him, and I said unto her the next day, Give thy son that we may eat him, and she hath hid her son. Elisha said, a couple verses later, Elisha says, Hear ye the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, Tomorrow about this time shall a measure of fine flour be sold for a shekel, 2 measures of barley for a shekel, in this gate, in the gates of Samaria. Now, if you remember the story, God sent a delusion on the besieging army of Syria. They fled thinking that the Israelites had made a treaty with the Hittites or the Egyptians, and that the armies were coming, and they fled the field. They abandoned their camp. So the next day, the Samaritans went out, they looted the camp, and indeed, the prophecy was fulfilled. There was fine flour being sold in the gates of Samaria for a shekel the very next day. So what we see here is pricing where a fourth of a cab of dove's dung was sold for 5 pieces of silver. The next day, you would not buy that. Value is subjective, and it's subjective by individual. It varies from individual to individual. We can't measure what your value is against what my value is necessarily. The one woman's child was much more valuable to her than the second woman's child. Well, she'd had a belly full of the first woman's child. Her values had changed. And so your value is subjective. It changes by the individual. And time factors into this equation as well. One day, something is valuable, the next day it's not. Think about Beanie Babies, think about collectibles. It works that way. And these economic concepts are all necessary if we're going to understand what money is. That's the reason we're going through this. So we've talked about behavior, we've talked about scarcity, and alternatives. And alternatives close the circle. Alternatives are choices, and choices lead to human action. When you have a choice, you can go this way, you can go that way, you can stand pat. It's all a choice, and what you do demonstrates the value that you're placing on the things that you are working to obtain, or the things you're working to flee. Whatever it is that you're working at, your actions are the underpinnings of economic action. All action is an attempt to exchange a less satisfactory state of affairs for a more satisfactory state of affairs. The fact of the matter is, if somebody points a gun at your head and says, do this or I'm going to shoot you, you have a choice there. You do. You can choose to stand on principle and get shot, or you could choose that day, that moment, to do whatever it was that you're being forced to do. But what's happening is there's a scale of values that you're carrying around with you. There's something that's going to be more important to you. The less satisfactory state of affairs might be to stand on principle, might be to cave. Whichever. You're going to act, and how you act is going to demonstrate the value that you're placing on the object that you're trying to obtain. And that is, all human action is economic, because all action is an attempt at trade. You're trading either with somebody or with yourself. You're trading a less satisfactory state for a more satisfactory state. Now, the sum total of all our actions, bargaining, work, payments, legal or illegal activity, demonstrates the value that we place on an object of our efforts. This is what we call imputation. This is the economic term, imputation. In my pocket, I carry around 2 pieces of silver. Now you can't really see them. I should have taken a picture. This was a 1928 peace dollar, a silver dollar. My dad carried this around all his adult life. You can't read the date. You can't read anything on it. You can kind of sort of see the picture of the Liberty head, and there's sort of a bit of an eagle on the back. And this is just a piece of silver. This is a 1 ounce round of silver, 99% pure, about the same in weight. Now this one's pretty thin. This one actually has a little bit more silver, but which is more valuable? Well, now if any one of you found these 2 things on the ground, this would be more valuable to you. But this one's more valuable to me, because this was my dad's. I am imputing more value to this than I'm imputing to this, but you might not. So the point I'm trying to make here is that imputation is subjective. It varies by person, and it also, the important thing is who's placing the value on the object, the imputation. Now we talk about imputation in the Bible all the time, do we not? We should understand imputation better than most because it's in the Bible. Abraham believed, and it was reckoned, it was imputed unto him as righteousness. Now, who did the imputing? And here's our gospel lesson tonight. Who did the imputing there? The imputer was God. Now we just had a lesson on imputation of value on these 2 pieces of silver. It sends chills up my spine. I'm going to kick you off right now. When I think that God is imputing Christ's righteousness to me. The value of Christ has been imputed to me. And what are the implications of that? And what are the implications of that for all of us and how we treat one another? We really need to keep that in mind. And so, imputation, I beg of you, try to get your arms around the idea of imputation, because it's not just economic, although it is economic, it is the underpinnings of the gospel as well. So with an idea of imputation, let's start to talk about money. What is money? Money definitions. Money is defined as a medium of exchange. It's also defined as a means of trade. Well, what do those things mean? There are different kinds of economies. Not every economy necessarily has money. The first and most basic kind of economy is what was called a subsistence economy. And where we had that was in Genesis, when Adam was thrown out of the garden, even in the garden, he was subsisting. He was existing by the sweat of his brow. By the sweat of your face you'll eat bread until you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for your dust, and to dust you shall return. And he was sent out. He worked to eat. And that's all there was. He didn't need money, he just needed, he made tools, he invested time to make tools, which is what we call capital investment or capital equipment, but had a simple subsistence economy. Now it doesn't take long before you specialize. You get good at something and you specialize. And families did that and started to trade among themselves, and what you did is you traded this good for that good. That's called a barter economy. And we have an example here from just Genesis 4, the next chapter. Lamech took into himself 2 wives, and the one was Ada, the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of those who play the lyre and pipe. As for Zillah, she also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of implements of bronze and iron. We have our first rancher. We have our first entertainer. We have our first smithy. Specialization. This is what happens. Now what do you do if you're the village smithy and you want artichokes? A barter economy relies on what we call the coincidence of wants. You have to find an artichoke farmer who wants your bronze or your forged goods. So it's very inconvenient. And eventually, that inconvenience leads to what we call a money economy. And how does it do that? It's a natural outgrowth. You have your bronze, you want the artichokes. So your artichoke farmer doesn't want your bronze. You trade your bronze now for something. Maybe it's something that you know that the artichoke farmer wants. And then you trade that something for the artichokes. Well, you went from your bronze to your artichokes by means of a medium, something in between. It was right in the middle, the medium of exchange. It was money. So the commodity that has the most desirability in any economy, that's what gets used for indirect exchange. So we changed the bronze to the in-between commodity. Maybe it was something shiny, a nugget. Maybe it was a gem. Who knows? But what becomes the most desirable commodity that's most desired by the most people is what becomes money. And so we have that evolution of money from a barter economy. The first reference to money was Genesis 17, where it was talked about money, and perhaps before that where it says that Abraham was very rich in cattle and silver and gold, and we'll actually come back to that in a little bit. Because money is the most marketable commodity in an economy. All other items are valued in terms of that money commodity, and the economic term for that is pricing. We price things in terms of the commodity that's the most valuable. So in our economy, we price things in dollars because that's our medium of exchange. In ancient economies, they probably price things in ounces or pounds or weight. But keep in mind that money, although a medium of exchange, is not necessarily wealth. Wealth is defined as something of value. Okay, now how do we make that distinction? The easy way to do that is to think of our old friend Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is shipwrecked. He has a chance to go out to the ship a couple of times to get some stuff. He's on a desert island. He thinks he's all alone. What's he going to go out to the ship for? It's breaking up on the reef. He's not going to be able to get everything. Well, he's going to grab knives and cutting tools. He's going to get barrels. He's going to get flint. He's going to get fishing line. Is he going to go to the captain's quarters and take his box of gold coins? No. He doesn't have time for that, and he doesn't need it. It's not valuable to him. It's not wealth. He's being very subjective in his imputation of value to the things that he's going to bring off that ship. So we see that wealth, these things constituted wealth to Robinson Crusoe, but the gold coins did not. Wealth is different than money. Money is necessary when there's trade between parties. As we saw, the money acts as a medium of exchange, so you can get from where what you're making to what you want. So trade is a social phenomenon. Robinson Crusoe had nobody to trade with. Money then is a social need. It's vital for the division of labor. Think about the bronze to artichokes, and the more money we have, it will increase. The more people get accustomed to using money, it will increase and encourage the division of labor. The more division of labor and the more specialization we have in an economy will lead to more wealth overall, because as people specialize, they're making things that I never even thought of. A clicker, computers, ketchup, I don't know, all those things that my mind wouldn't have thought of, but now I see it. I'm going to trade what I'm doing for a medium of exchange so that I can go get that. Money is necessary. It's a social need. It eliminates the reliance on the coincidence of wants. So now we have an understanding of what money does. Let's talk about what makes good money. What are the characteristics of money? Now, there have been a lot of different kinds of money in history. Originally, probably cattle was the first money. Pecus is the Latin word for cow, and it's the root of the word pecuniary, which of course is a financial term. Theo was the Anglo-Saxon word for money, and cow, it's the root of the word fee. Wampum has been used as money. We've had bear claws used as money. We've had these things used as money. On the Isle of Yap, these stone donuts known as rei were used as money. They were very valuable. These things, some of these were as large as 12 feet across. The smallest, I think, were about a foot across. But those were used as money. So we had those on the Isle of Yap in the Western Pacific. Salt has been used as money. The Latin word for salt is sal or salus, which is the root for salary. We've also had pieces of paper with the president pictures on them used as money. So, you know, there's a lot of different kinds of media have been used as money. The Bible has an interesting commentary on money here in Genesis 47. And Joseph gathered up all the money. This was after or during the famine in Egypt. Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed." Well, there was still money. How did the money fail? The value of the money fell to near worthlessness because you couldn't eat it. The grain had become the most tradable commodity in their economy. So the crisis changed their scale of values and changed how they were imputing value to things. Some versions of the Bible say that the money was gone, but it's really more or less the same thing. The money was gone because it was of no value. It was useless. The imputation of value comes into play. Money is worth what people think it is. Sometimes they think gold is worth much. Sometimes they think grain is worth much. You can't eat your gold. Now, the best money tends to have these following characteristics. It's durable. It doesn't die, rust, or deteriorate. Now, cows don't rust, but they do die and deteriorate. Salt. You know, think about these things that we just talked about, the different media that we were just talking about. Transportable. Now, the cattle were great for that because they moved themselves. The stone donuts, not so much. Uniform, same quality, easily recognized. Again, with cattle, think about that. Where you're going to open it up the mouth, count the teeth, or whatever. Divisible. You're not dividing a cow. Salt, however, really worked well for something like that. It's scarce. It's not easily faked. It's got high value in relation to volume and weight. The silver that I held up tonight, an ounce of silver at 20 bucks roughly, an ounce, the very same weight of gold at $12.50. It's about 60 times different in the relationship to volume and its weight and the value in the weight. So scarcity is an important part of what makes good money. So a quick review. Money is a social phenomenon. There's no need for money unless there's society in which trade is taking place. It's a commodity that's in greatest demand in that society. It tends to have the physical characteristics that we just listed. So money's simple, right? What haven't we talked about? We haven't talked about the government. Our previous examples of money, they're natural outgrowths of trade between free actors, people who are interacting with each other freely. Money arose naturally in all of these situations that we just described. So you get a government involved. What's the government going to do? They're going to say, only calcite, because that's what these things are made of. Only calcite, no granite, no basalt. Do we really, did the islanders on Yap need a government to tell them that? In prison camps in World War II, cigarettes were used as money in the camps. They didn't have money, but they traded cigarettes. Or Lucky Strikes only, non-filtered only. I mean, you don't have a government saying what is the value going to be, what is going to be money in those economies. These things arise naturally. We'll talk a lot more about government as we go. But first, let's talk about how we got so confused about money. I mean, we think about the Federal Reserve, we hear about Federal Reserve meetings, and we don't even know what they're talking about. Where did that money come from? All those kinds of things. So how do we get so confused about this? How do we go from durable, transportable, uniform, divisible, and scarce to this? Well, actually, it was a quite natural phenomenon. In the history of money, there have been several occurrences of paper money. Most notably, the one we're going to talk about here is Western civilization. There was several notable instances in China as well, under some of the dynasties there. But we're going to talk about how we came to paper money here in our Western civilization. As economies developed and the specialization and the division of labor increased in Renaissance Europe, all of a sudden we have some very, very wealthy merchantmen and craftsmen and guild members. And they're so wealthy that they couldn't store their money at home. It didn't feel safe. So it wasn't safe at home. Where is it going to be safe? Well, it's going to be safe in a safe. Now, who's got the safe in Middle Ages Europe? Who's got a safe? Well, the goldsmith was the guy who had the safe because he needed to store this high value, what traded as money. The gold ingots, the gold pieces would trade as money. So the goldsmiths had safes. And so the merchant, maybe the shoemaker, he's got a pile of money, doesn't want to keep it under his bed, it's keeping him awake at night. So he goes down to his goldsmith and he deposits his money in the safe. And he gets a receipt from the goldsmith that says, I have your money in my safe. When you want it, come back. So came time to make more shoes. He needed to go to the tanner and buy something. So he goes back to the goldsmith, he redeems his money with a note. He gives the note back to the goldsmith, gets his money out. Then he goes to market, he buys the leather, he makes some stuff, he sells some stuff, and now he's got more money. And well, now what? Well, he takes the real money back to the goldsmith for a deposit. He gets a receipt, a note. Rinse and repeat, over and over, over and over. Well, we talked about coincidence of wants as being inconvenient. This is kind of inconvenient. So what do? Well, you stop going back to the goldsmith to get your money out. And what you do is you start to trade your paper. You take your paper note to the tanner to buy your leather goods and say, my money's on deposit down there. Here's the note. If you want it, you can go get it. And so the notes started trading in the economy as if they were money. And the notes became thought of as money, even though they only represented the money, which was on deposit at the goldsmith. So you see, it's a natural progression. There's nothing evil or any evil intention in it. So remember, thinking something is valuable imputes value to it. So we impute value to this paper stuff because we know that we can go trade it for milk and eggs. What we just described is what's known as 100% reserve or full reserve currency, which means that everything that's represented on the note is on deposit at the goldsmith, at the bank. But we can operate under fractional reserve currency. What does fractional reserve currency mean? Well, if you guessed that not all the stuff is on deposit, you're right. The Renaissance goldsmith bankers figured out that most of that gold sat in their safes idle because now it's just the paper floating around out there in the economy. All these notes representing the money that's on deposit are doing all the trade, and the gold's just sitting here. So what do? Well, let's write up some extra notes, put them out into the economy, and let them float around. Because not everybody's coming back at the same time for the gold or the silver that's on deposit. And so now you have only a fraction of what's being circulated in currency, in notes. You have only a fraction on deposit, and now that's what's fractional reserve banking. what they did is they wrote up additional claims on the gold. And then what they did is they inflated the money supply, and they inflated it artificially without real money. And so we have a handful of the Big Ten that have been violated now, right? Thou shalt not have any gods before me. You're creating money out of nothing. You're playing God. You're speaking money into creation. Thou shalt not bow down to idols. Inflation is the result of greed. Colossians 3:5 says that greed is idolatry. Thou shalt not steal. You're trading something of no value, a piece of paper, for goods of value. Thou shalt not bear false witness. You're lying about the value of the money. And in the thou shalt not covet, which is part of the greed. And in the United States, we have "In God We Trust" all over our money, which of course is taking the Lord's name in vain. There's another interesting commentary, not much thought about, this about inflation. Exodus, if you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. That's his only covering. It's his garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And it will be that when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. We read that and we think, oh, that mean lender, he might not give the cloak back, and the guy's going to be out in the cold. But what else is being talked about here? Well, you're talking about collateral. What's being taught here, besides withholding loans for poor brethren, is that it's immoral to secure multiple loans with the same piece of collateral. If that poor guy was an unscrupulous poor guy, he might use his cloak as collateral for multiple loans. The poor man, he could not indebt himself many times over on the basis of one piece of collateral if the lender held the garment. And fractional reserve is just like that. The fractional reserve bank has indebted itself to the depositors. It can't possibly redeem all the deposits when demanded. It's using the collateral multiple times. And multiple times, and multiple times. It's astonishing. We aren't going to get into details of fractional reserve banking as it exists here, but it's just horrible. It also points out that our money system is based on debt. We're borrowing the money into existence, and we're doing it by multiplying the issuance of the notes based upon the deposits of the money owed to the depositors. So inflation, well, by inflating that money supply, it's not the same thing as rising prices. We look at rising prices and say, oh, that's inflation. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. Rising prices are a symptom of inflation, and let's talk about that. A simple island economy. Only thing in the economy is 100 kettles and 100 pieces of silver. Price for each kettle is one piece of silver. And vice versa, you can price your silver in kettles if you wanted to do it this way. But now suppose 100 pieces of silver wash up on the shore. Now the price of each kettle is 2 silver pieces. Did the value of the kettles change? Or did the price of the kettles change? Did the value of the silver change? That's what happened here. Now the money supply inflated. Not artificially though. This money supply inflated because we have actually 100 more pieces of silver. This happened in the 1840s. We've heard of the 49ers, the gold rush in California. There was a tremendous amount of gold that was pushed into the United States economy with the finding of all that gold, the mining of all that gold. And prices went up because the money supply was inflated. It did go up, but with real money. At the time, it went up with real money. So we see the rising prices is a symptom of inflation. And now we can artificially inflate, which is what our banks are doing. And that's, I just wanted to point that out, that the inflation is causing rising prices. We oftentimes interchange rising prices with the word inflation, and we probably shouldn't do that. I'm not suggesting that we're going to stop doing that, but you ought to understand what we're talking about when we talk about inflation or rising prices. In Isaiah 1:22, your silver has become dross, your wine mixed with water. The civil authorities are supposed to protect us from debasement of our currency. You can take a silver coin, and instead of having all silver, you would add dross to it, you would add tin to it, you would add copper to it, and reduce the value of the silver that's actually being passed around in the coin. That's happened over and over and over in history. There were points in the Roman Empire where what they did was mint up copper coins and kind of dip them in silver. As soon as they wore off, you start to see that copper, and the idea of a brown nose also comes from the wearing off of the silver on the nose of the emperor on the coins that were being debased. Leviticus tells us, do no wrong in judgment, measurement of weight or capacity. Have just balances, just weights, a just ephah and a just hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. God says that false weights and balances are an abomination. Just weights are a delight. So we have a lot of commentary about keeping just measurement, and the government is supposed to protect us from these kinds of things. But the governments have become the debasers in chief. We just gave an example of how the Romans had done that. And inflation of paper money under government auspices, under the Federal Reserve System that we have, is nothing less. The government's debasement of coinage encourages the populace to water our wine. The government is an agent of corruption through the money, through inflation. I'll take you back, a walk in time. Some of you are too young to remember this. I remember it vividly. Imagine it's 1965, and last year was the final year of full silver coinage. It wasn't full silver, but it was 70%. And now it's 1965, and we have 40% silver half dollars, and we still have the full 100% silver half dollars circulating. So, you're a baker, and the cakes are in market for sale, 3 cakes for half a buck. I'm sorry, you're not the baker, you're the buyer. Which half dollar are you going to use to buy the cakes? Are you going to use the full silver, or are you going to use the slug? Well, you're going to keep your silver, you're going to throw it in a can, and maybe you'll go and look at it when you get home. But you're going to spend the slug. Now what about the baker? What are his choices? He's got 3. He can continue as if nothing has changed. Or he can increase his prices by 2.5 times to get the same amount of silver that he used to get. Or he can debase his cakes with cheaper materials and pretend that they're still worth a half dollar worth of silver. What are the consequences on each choice? Well, if he continues as if nothing has changed, he gets stuck with phony coins. Now he's only getting 40% of what he used to get. Or number 2, he could increase his prices by 2.5 times. Do you think he's going to lose any sales? If the competitors are using option number 3, making lesser quality cakes, the customers are probably going to buy the lesser cakes. Or number 3, he could debase his cakes and pretend, and he can defraud his customers, at least until they figure out the new rules. So what we see is how monetary debasement or inflation becomes the engine of corruption in society. Our government is pushing society into corruption. The money becomes the yeast of corruption for all society. Whenever we see corrupted money without widespread complaint on part of the people, we see corrupted people. The people are joining in. They're saying, hey, the government can cheat, we're all going to cheat. Let's pretend the wine is full strength. So Isaiah was warning the people against inflation, and he was condemning the rulers and the people for accepting the inflation and cheating as a way of life. The people were corrupt. Isaiah's warning was the same as Jesus' parables about bad trees and good fruit. You can't bring forth good out of evil. You're bringing forth evil out of the evil treasure in the heart. There's a host of things we can say about this. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about how this drives corruption in society. Debts are a huge part of this. Dross is imagery for sin. God has warned us a lot about sin and dross. The imagery is used over and over in the scripture. When we accept it, we're in trouble. There is a relationship between our moral corruption as a nation and morally corrupt government and debased currency. Make no mistake, the currency is part of the problems that we're fighting with today. Continued violation of God's commands is always punished, and why is that? Well, because God won't be mocked. He has promised again, over and over, that He will bless and He will curse. Obedience and disobedience. Now, it's almost impossible to think of money as not being issued by and regulated by the state. And why is that? Why do governments always take control of the money? It's always been true for thousands and thousands of years. Government insinuates itself into regulating the money. Well, it's because the government doesn't get its revenue for goods and services. They're not competing on the basis of superior services, as anybody who's ever stood in a DMV line will testify. It's got to get its revenue by seizure. It has to seize it. It gets it by force. Now, if you're in a barter economy and you're the government and you want taxes, you're going to have to go out and grab it. You got to go get it. That's heavily resisted. People get kind of cranky when the revenuer shows up at the door. This is what, you know, the whole thing in the Appalachians with the folks who were making moonshine. The revenuers show up and they're shooting at them. They get a little bit cranky about the revenuers. And so if you can counterfeit, it's less understood and therefore it's less resisted. People don't understand that inflationary process that we just talked about, that we just described. That the bankers are issuing money, and by inflating the money supply, they get to spend it at full value. After it's dispersed through the economy for a while, and it becomes obvious to everybody, well then the prices go up and we all suffer. They're stealing it from us as they print it. The government is the one doing it. So, to be really effective at the counterfeiting, it helps if you've established control over the coinage, over the money. If you're going to be counterfeiting, you need to be in charge. So you establish that control as the government. You're going to regulate it to protect people. Sure you are. And you're going to, what's often done, it's very interesting, often done is it's renamed. Our dollar is actually based on this German word, a Thaler, which was a place where a lot of silver was mined in the Middle Ages. The franc was named after the people. The shilling was named after a place as well. That was Austrian money. It's interesting that the English still call theirs pound sterling. It's a measurement. They never renamed it. But they were strong enough with their central bank that they didn't need to. But these are ways of establishing control. Once you regulate it, then you rename it, and you just get it further and further away from the real money, the weight, the commodity. And then you can debase it. Inflation is a stealth tax. We don't understand it. Because we don't understand it, the government is taxing us into oblivion. So think of those charts that we put up at the beginning. Those amounts of money are being created out of thin air. Now, we don't see the effects of those yet because they're still stuck in the Federal Reserve, but there comes a day when they come out, and it's not going to be so easy to mop up all that stuff. It's no coincidence that the Income Tax Amendment and the Federal Reserve were established in the same year, 1913. The 16th Amendment passed, and so-called passed. We won't even go into that. And the Federal Reserve was established on Christmas Eve of 1913 with a bare quorum of people in Congress. So Inflation, and which is Federal Reserve, that's all the Federal Reserve is about, is inflating, and the income tax is about government revenues. They're one and the same problem. So again, a quick review. Money is a commodity. It's the most marketable commodity in an economy. It evolves spontaneously in any economy. It needs no stamp of approval from a government to function as money. Like we talked about with the stones and cigarettes, all the other things that we talked about with how it arises naturally, spontaneously in any economy. So, what does a biblical monetary system look like? It would look like this. It would have standard weights and measures with penalties for violating the standards. If you think about what a government is supposed to do, well, we'll get there. A biblical monetary system would prohibit fractional reserve banking. As we pointed out, it's stealing. It violates so many of the Ten Commandments that it's an abomination. It would allow competitive entry into the goldsmith's banking business. If you want to open a bank, open a bank. However, understand that if you lie and cheat, you're going to be penalized. That's what the government's for. You're violating your contract. But if you allow competitive entry into the goldsmithing business or the banking business, as long as you enforce contracts and people are putting their own money at risk to run the bank, then that's a fair deal. We had I'm going to digress for just a moment. There was an era in this country that was known as the free banking era. And it was the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Free banking was when people would get together, some directors would get together, they would form a bank, they'd put their own capital in, and it would be fractional reserve. What used to pass for a viable fraction of the reserves was about 40%. What people in banking understood was that if you had 40% specie in your vault, that you could circulate, you could have circulation based on that. As territories began to expand, the state governments, the territorial governments started to force the free banks to take state bonds as collateral and count them as specie. And so then what happened is, officially, they had enough on reserve because the government said, you now have, by law, this counts as a reserve. Well, the banker said, as long as I'm covered by that law, and then so the reserve went from 40% to 30% to 20% to 10%. Well, this is still free banking. There was no Federal Reserve, there's no FDIC, there's none of that kind of thing. And people would go and actually read the financial statements of the banks from where they had their money. And they look and they realize, oh, wait a minute, there's nothing in there. I'm going to go get my money out. And you had a run on the bank. What did they run for? They ran for their money. They ran for the gold. They didn't run for paper. They ran to get their gold and silver out. That's the fallacy. As much as I like It's a Wonderful Life, we've all seen that movie, that bank run where people were running to the bank to get their money out. They weren't running to get the paper out. They were running to get their gold out. They were running to get their silver out, not the paper. So, just a final word on that. The directors of those banks were personally liable for the debts of the bank. If that bank failed, those men were ruined. That's not the way it works today. Today we have officers of banks, and we have shareholders, and they're all protected by law, and they're all protected by the government. Allowing competitive entry into a real banking system would be a big advantage. No legal tender laws under a biblical monetary system. No laws say this note is legal tender for all debts private and public. None of that. You decide what you want to take in your contract with your contractual dealings with other people. You decide what you're going to take for payment. You don't have to listen to a government say, oh, you must take this because we're charging. Now this gets a little bit controversial. A biblical monetary system is not necessarily based on gold, silver, precious metals. It shouldn't be. It should not be. And here's why. Because gold does not have any intrinsic value. Think about Robinson Crusoe. There was no value in the gold and the silver to Robinson Crusoe. See, for something to have intrinsic value means that it has value outside of human action, which means it has value outside of our imputation. That means it's autonomous. Well, there's nothing on this earth, nothing in creation, that's autonomous. Only God is autonomous. Only God has intrinsic value. Gold has value because we say it has value. Now, it tends to hold its value. It's always been valued in human history, but it doesn't have intrinsic value. And we need not base a biblical monetary system on gold for just that reason. We need to trade one with another and decide by contract how we're going to pay each other. Thinking that only gold or only silver must be used as money falls into the trap that money can be defined by someone, and guess who's going to define it? The government always turns out to be the definer because they have the guns. And so we're all going to turn to them and say, please enforce this standard. No. Please enforce our contracts. Don't worry about the standards. Enforce our contracts. This guy, I contracted for him to pay me in silver. He's not paying me in silver. You need to enforce the contract. You need to punish him. You have the sword, I don't. That's the government. The biblical case for freedom and money is the same as the biblical case for freedom in general. The civil government, and this is the purpose of governments, governments prohibit, punish fraud and violence. That's all the government, civil government, is supposed to do. When they start providing positive rewards, they're starting to be the savior. They're starting to be Messiah. They're starting to do all those things. God has delegated to the civil government the sword to be the avenger and to avenge wrongdoing and terrorize wrongdoers. And that's it. Not reward and not promote. The rest is up to individuals. So we know that fractional reserve banking is absolutely fraudulent. Debasing metal coinage, it's fraudulent. Inflation is fraudulent. Government-issued money has invariably always been debased, resulting in inflation and the corruption of the people. The contracts that we engage in, one with another, should be written in any way that the parties want. You want gold, you want wampum, you want the stone donuts. You write the contract, you decide how you're going to be paid. What's going to be the medium of exchange in your contract? What you have to remember about money, there's nothing magic about it. I hope this talk demonstrated that tonight. It's simply the most marketable, desirable commodity, and it should be a commodity, something you can touch and feel underlying your money, but it's what you decide on. It's the product of voluntary human action, not bureaucratic design, and it's the product of freedom. It reinforces freedom. We talked about how dishonest money reinforces corruption. Honest money reinforces freedom and honesty. Someday, this system is going to collapse. We also know that someday we're going to have a revival. And we're going to have a populace, one way or another, that's committed to biblical law. There's going to be a constituency for a truly free and biblical money system. Its purpose, the overriding purpose of what we talked about tonight, is that we understand we can be advocates for that system when it's called upon, when it's called for, but we need to understand it. And so I beg that we would promote the best alternatives, things we just talked about, in a biblical monetary system, instead of compromises like a state-sponsored gold standard, which will inevitably be hijacked. And that is my talk on biblical economy. Are there any questions?
Good job.